big data and big opportunity. It'll be, heard some interesting controversial words about cloud from Roger this morning, so this should be a very interesting panel. We have Antra Bhargava from Grant Thornton, who's going to coordinate and facilitate the next session. So I would like to introduce her. So here she is.
That was a good start. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Cloud Computing Seminar of ITLG's Innovation Summit. We at Grant Thornton are delighted to be sponsors of the seminar, and I would like to thank the ITLG for giving us the opportunity to be involved. We have a packed couple of hours ahead, so I'm one of the few privileged people who know what's coming up, and you're in for a treat. Without much further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Peter Vale, tax partner at Grant Thornton, with a particular focus on international taxation and cross-border tax transactions. Peter will be providing us with a brief, and you'll be delighted to hear a jargon-free overview of the tax reasons as to why so many global cloud companies have established a presence in Ireland. So over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Antra, and good afternoon, everybody. And I suppose what better way to help your lunch digest than listen to me go on about tax for the next 10 minutes or so. The good news is that it will only be 10 minutes. And I also think you'll get something out of it. Certainly from the conversations I had with a few people at the reception last night, tax is important and it is of interest to people generally. We're at an innovation summit, and people in business who innovate will typically hope to make profits, maybe not in year one, but in year 2 or year 3. And obviously it goes without saying that the less tax you pay on those profits, the more money you're going to have to reinvest in the business or to enjoy personally. So I think tax is important. And what we're going to look at today is just some fairly straightforward ways that companies can use or can benefit from Ireland's tax regime to substantially reduce their tax liability and hence increase their after-tax profits. Now hopefully I can get this clicker to okay, is it the second button down?
Yeah, here you go.
Oh, apologies. Okay. Okay. It's going to have a cloud computing technology focus, given the group. So specifically, we're going to be talking about technology-intensive companies, companies that might have a presence in Ireland or in the US or both. Generally, companies that will value IP. So you may have valuable IP now, or you may have IP that you hope will become valuable in a fairly short space of time. Groups that typically will value R&D, that will carry out a lot of R&D work, and may or may not have a global focus. But one thing that all of these companies will have in common is that if they can lower their tax bill, they will have more of this. And I think it's fair to say that you can draw a line between tax and funding, because if you've got a tax-efficient structure in place relative to your peers, really what you have is you've got an interest-free, non-refundable, recurring line of credit. And that's not a bad thing. So what are we going to talk about for the next 10 minutes, or 9 minutes now we're down to? Which cloud computing companies have come to Ireland? Why have they come? How have they come? What sort of tax have they saved by coming to Ireland? And we conclude with some key messages. Okay, so the cloud computing companies that have come to Ireland. It's a fairly strong list. It's really a who's who of the technology world. I think it's a really strong slide, and it's that on its own is such a compelling argument as to why should you look at Ireland in choosing where to locate. I think particularly when you consider that when these companies were surveyed, the primary reason that most of these companies decided to come to Ireland in the first place was the corporate tax regime. It wasn't the only reason, and Rory will allude to some of the other non-tax reasons later, but tax was the primary reason. And now, having said that, tax should never be the tail that wags the dog, and you'll never do something purely for tax reasons. But having said that, if you don't consider the the tax implications of your business model at all, then potentially you're at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis your peers. Okay, just delving a little bit more into why these companies chose Ireland as opposed to any other jurisdiction. I mean, the main reason is the 12.5% tax rate. And whether you're a US company looking at Ireland or you're already in Ireland, there's a clear incentive to try and park as much of your profits in Ireland to bring your tax rate down to as close to 12.5% as you can. And the rationale is simple. You're trying to move profits from a high tax jurisdiction to a low tax jurisdiction, as I say, hopefully reduce your overall effective tax rate. Just note revenue ruling availability. If there's any doubt as to your tax status, you can always write to the Irish Revenue and get a ruling from them as to your tax position. It removes uncertainty, and investors like certainty. Executive remuneration planning. One of the issues for US groups coming to Ireland and trying to encourage their key US guys, perhaps in the early startup phase of the Irish operation, to move to Ireland, is you're asking them to up sticks and maybe come over for 2 to 3 years, and that's a big ask. What might motivate them to do that? I mean, our climate might be favourable towards groups or cloud computing groups with large data centres, but it's not really a deal clincher when you're trying to convince these executives to come over to Ireland. So I think we need something else. What the government brought in is effectively a tax break for executives coming to Ireland. So if you've got a US guy coming to Ireland, there's up to a 30% tax break on salary that they can earn. So that's quite a compelling reason. And it might help tilt the balance towards Ireland for those guys, because as I say, you're asking them to uproot themselves, possibly their family. For companies in cloud computing and in technology in general, there's a suite of innovation-related tax reliefs. We just look at a few. One is the R&D tax credit. It's a 25% R&D tax credit. That's on top of your normal R&D deduction. So what does that mean? If you're paying, let's say, 100 grand in R&D salaries, you're going to get a refund from the Irish Exchequer of 37,500. IP, a lot of US groups, or some US groups, will consider moving their IP to Ireland, their intellectual property to Ireland. It's not straightforward. You've got to consider the US tax issues, and there are US tax issues. They generally are manageable, and if you can do it, you can substantially reduce your overall tax rate. Indeed, whether you could be an Irish company with an IP already in Ireland, or you could be a US group looking to move your IP to Ireland, you can potentially bring your tax rate down to as low as 2.5%. And in fact, if you add in the R&D tax credit, you can actually get to a position where your tax is wiped out completely, or you can even get a refund of tax that you haven't actually paid. Just note patents there. It's not a tax point, but often patents will be bundled into the IP, and you can protect your patents through registration with the Irish Patents Office. Grants are a form of non-tax incentivisation, and Rory will allude to that too. The last circle is a friendly international tax regime. I suppose what I mean by that is, how does your Irish company interact with the rest of the world? So it's going to deal with the first four on their own. And really, what I'm looking at here is, how do you get your money into the Irish company? How do you get your money out of the Irish company? Minimising tax leakage. So if you've got an Irish company, it might be earning a lot of income from overseas, you'd be looking to minimise your overseas withholding taxes. Your Irish company might also hold overseas subsidiaries. You'd be looking to pull the dividends back from them with no extra Irish tax. And generally, as a result of Ireland's domestic tax regime and our tax treaty network, you get the right answer. So you get all the money into Ireland, very little tax leakage. How do you get the money out then? You may want to bring some of it back to the US. And in practice, there's rarely, if ever, any withholding tax on outbound payments. So be it dividends, royalties, interest, you can get the money back to the US with no leakage in Ireland. Limited transfer pricing. Ireland did bring in transfer pricing last year. It's very little practical impact. Most groups are trying to move profits into Ireland, not the other way around. So not surprisingly, it hasn't had much impact. We don't have any subpart F, which is a US tax rule. Harmonised VAT regime. So if you've got an Irish company that's selling across Europe, maybe in 10 different jurisdictions, you've only got to register for VAT in Ireland. Typically, the sales will be VAT-free. You don't need to register in the other jurisdictions. So I suppose just going back, what does all that mean? It means you've got a favourable headline tax rate of 12.5%. For companies in the cloud computing technology space, the ability to bring that rate down further, and then a flexible regime in terms of how does that Irish company interact with the rest of the group. So we're almost getting to the recap stage now. How do groups take advantage of it? Typically, it's for the majority, it's the 12.5% tax rate. Other groups, as I say, will also have a holding company, use an Irish holding company to hold the overseas investments. We've got a benign holding company regime. Some groups, subject to US tax issues if it's US IP, will also move their IP into Ireland. And I suppose, I'm not sure if you can read the bubbles there. The key point here is that the more risk and reward you can transfer into the Irish company, the more you're going to benefit from the Irish tax regime, and the more you're going to get, the closer you'll get your overall group's rate down to 12.5%. It is worth noting that there are some groups, US groups, that have substantial operations in Ireland, and they really don't benefit from the 12.5% rate at all. They house the majority of their IP outside Ireland, possibly in a haven jurisdiction, but they do benefit from the Irish regime for virtue of the fact that the Irish regime does allow them to channel the royalties back to that low tax, potentially a haven jurisdiction, without any Irish withholding tax. So there's no leakage in Ireland. So that is another way how those groups have benefited from Ireland's tax regime. But they're in the minority, and for the most part, it's the 12.5% rate that is the key attraction for US groups in Ireland. Very quick example, it's a live case that we have. Company, turnover 5 million, basically it's making 2 million in profits, paying tax of 250 grand on that, 12.5%. You can ignore the last two rows there for the moment. If you delve deeper into this company, of its cost of 3 million, 2 million of them were salaries. These salaries were R&D guys, they spent about 60% of the time on R&D. So when you're working out the tax for this company, tax is say at the 12.5% rate, 250 grand, but when you factor in the R&D tax credit, they actually end up with no tax. It completely wipes out their tax liability, and they get a refund of 50,000, which, as I said, is corporate tax that they didn't actually pay in the first place. If this company had a bad year, didn't make any profit, they would actually have got a refund of the full 300 grand from the Irish revenue. Just worth noting, a change in the finance bill, it'll be enacted towards the end of this month, will enable the company, instead of claiming that credit itself, it can actually elect to hand out that R&D credit to its employees, to the guys directly involved in the R&D. So it's another sign that Ireland is really pro-innovation. It's trying to create a smart economy. Okay, nearly at the end. In fact, I am at the end. What key messages will I leave you with? Ireland is open for business. There's no question about that. It's a tax-friendly environment. As I said earlier, just to reiterate, it's a low headline rate. There's a suite of reliefs there for technology and cloud computing companies that can drive the overall headline rate down to well below 12.5%. As I say, there are also a suite of reliefs and through our treaty network that enable that Irish company to interact in a favourable manner with other companies in the group. As Roger alluded to this morning, it is important to plan and to prepare, and same goes for tax planning. The earlier you plan, the better, the more benefit you'll get out of it. But we've helped companies, we've looked at companies in every stage of their development, and whatever stage you're at, you'll generally find that Ireland is open for business. Final comment before I hand back to Antra is that we have got an Invest in Ireland brochure. You find it on the tables, particularly for anybody flying home. If you've trouble sleeping, this is the one for you. So I'll hand back to Antra. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. We now move on to our first panel for the afternoon. The theme of the panel is Cloud Services and Big Data. I'd like to invite our moderator, Professor Breen McCrath from Dublin City University, Ireland's University of Enterprise. Very lucky to have Breen in the building today. Very topical because DCU was recently awarded the initial phase of the National Industry-Led Cloud Computing Technology Centre. So Breen, would you come to stage, please? And he will be joined by the panelists Chris Booty, Executive Director of AT&T, Sean O'Donoghue, Chief Information Officer of DreamWorks, Una Fox, Vice President, Walt Disney, Barry O'Sullivan, Senior Vice President and General Manager of Cisco's Collaboration Technology Group, and finally, last but not least, Neil Layden, Founder and Project Director of the International Digital Services Centre. I leave you in Breen's capable hands.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Antra. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have a fantastic panel assembled for you this afternoon. Thought leaders right across the cloud services and big data space. We've representatives from service providers, big data people, and infrastructure providers. And we'll be looking at key issues like security, monetization strategies, technology roadmaps, and so on. We've already done some work on this with the panel and looked at a range of general questions, which we're going to get into straight away. But you will have a chance at the end for a Q&A session from the floor itself, and we'll finish off then where each of our panelists will do some summing up. So over the next 40 minutes, we're going to dig deep into cloud services and big data. The first question I'm going to go with is really the stratification of the panel itself across big data service providers and infrastructure providers, and really a question to those of you who are service providers. This cloud revolution is really only starting, and I want you really to comment on the offerings, the possibilities, the challenges of the future, and really how disruptive this transformative revolution is going to be. And if I could start with Sean, please, to address that in the first instance.
Sure. I guess I kind of look at it from where I sit. When you talk about the cloud revolution, I actually think more in terms from the corporate side. It's more of a cloud evolution. And then really the revolution is more on the consumer side. You know, at DreamWorks, as you know, we make animated movies. But, you know, just some little facts. There's, you know, it takes 3 to 5 years to make one. It takes about 300 artists across 3 sites. It's about 60 million render hours to make a movie, 100 terabytes of data, 18,000 cores. So it's a lot of compute that we need to create an animated movie. So we've really been in cloud since 2003, really in the days of grid. And you know, since 2008, we've been using what today is commonly known as private cloud. We're looking a lot at, you know, how we make use of public cloud. But, you know, there are certain restrictions in those areas, such as how do we move a terabyte of data back and forth on a public cloud and use caching on public cloud networks. So that's kind of one side of on the corporate side for us, you know, the compute resource. And so to us, that's really an evolution. We've kind of moved from grid all the way through to now looking at how we make use of public. Also, you know, internally within the corporation, there's, you know, the concepts of collaboration. And, you know, Google applications, for example, being a good one. You know, great solution, gets us out of the business of maintaining traditional email systems, but, you know, what comes with it, the value that comes with it are things like corporate collaboration for all of the artists across the studio. So that's kind of the evolutionary side on corporate. I think, you know, for me what's interesting is the revolution on the consumer side and how content is being requested and consumed by consumers. And in particular, if you look at, you know, as we've heard earlier today, video consumption is a massive driver of resource usage. And if you look at, you know, when people stream movies, anything over the internet today, it's file-based, right? You're really just opening up a file and it's caching and streaming across. You know, what's interesting is to look at what I think is going to come in the near future are more the real-time streaming capabilities and, you know, using peer-to-peer technologies to orchestrate the delivery of real-time broadcast, if you like, onto devices.
Thank you indeed. Una, would you like to comment on this, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, similar to Sean, working for an entertainment company, you know, we've used, on the corporate side, we've used what I'd call software as a service type solutions for several years. I mean, it's over 10 years now since Salesforce.com, you know, really started to evolve. So that'll be one of the first solutions that we saw in the marketplace, you know, from a corporate perspective. I think that what we're seeing right now is there's been an evolution, as Sean said, in the enterprise, either creating some of your own private cloud or leveraging what's out there. But I think you know, the collaboration tools, that's a huge area for us. You know, particularly in the enterprise now, Yammer being in the cloud, you know, Google Mail, You know, what we're looking for when you talk about disruption, you know, just looking at some of the research that's coming now about this community of young people they call digital natives. So, you know, digital natives being, you know, the population 15 to 24 that are coming into the enterprise. They don't use email anymore. They use really, you know, the blogosphere tools like Tumblr to communicate. They're not even actually moving off of Facebook. I mean, they're really mainly communicating on Twitter. And so I think the pressure on us in the enterprise is to convert to more of that cloud-based leverage of services from that perspective.
Thanks, Una. Chris, what would the AT&T perspective be in this?
Well, sure. Just first of all, let's just size up the opportunity. I did a little bit of research. There's a lot of different information that's out there, but Forrester research is basically quoting that the opportunity for cloud in the future, starting off at less than $1 billion in 2011, will grow to $12 billion plus in 2018. So it's an amazing market opportunity. And I think that the revolution aspect of cloud is combining cloud capabilities that are effectively ways of optimizing data, you know, storage, content, processing power on demand, with the extension out to the actual experience for the customers. And I think the revolution that's taking place is looking at cloud computing plus the massive rollout of 4G high-speed wireless network access, plus the Wi-Fi that's available and accessible today. You have to have all three of those components in order to successfully achieve consumption and utilization of cloud services, and I think that that revolution is well underway.
Thank you. Barry, can I turn to you at this stage? I mean, Cisco is a major vendor of infrastructure. I mean, what are you hearing from customers in terms of customer needs?
Well, so first of all, Brian, I noticed you put the 3 University College Cork graduates on this side of the stage.
No marketing allowed, Barry. So.
We won't take it personally. I meet lots of customers and lots of CIOs, and you guys might think you're revolutionary, but you sound pretty revolutionary compared to a lot of CIOs I talk to when it comes to cloud. I think quite often the CIO feels caught in the middle, right? On the one hand, they have the users saying, you know, I want to bring my iPad to work, I want to consume everything from the cloud, I want to work on Facebook, and on the other hand, they have the business or the CEO saying, you know, I want reliability, scalability, data security. So that's what they're looking for. I find is solutions that allow them to get all the advantages of the cloud in terms of scalability and flexibility, but still keep the other things like security and reliability and so on.
Thanks, Barry. Some would say that successful companies in the future will be those that extract more value from big data through business intelligence and data analytics. Neil, I was hoping you might give us a few comments on that, please.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting areas for me is actually the data visualization, which is the next step. I've been working with a guy from Scotland who's a doctor of physics, but also a circus performer. And he's just shown me just an amazing insight into how we can look in new ways, especially because generally most of us are visual, how we interface with things, and just seeing how business data analytics can be visualized. I think that's a really important area, and I think there's very interesting small to medium-sized enterprises going to be popping up in that space.
Well, as a physics professor, I'm glad to know I'll have an alternative career at any stage. So, anyone else would like to comment on the data analytics business intelligence?
Just one other comment, and that is I think it's very important to move forward into the cloud environment, and first of all, start off by articulating what is the problem that you're trying to solve, or what is the value proposition that you're really trying to deliver. And I think with the analytics and the metrics, we tend to get overwhelmed in looking at the data and quantifying that, but being able to clearly anchor that back to the initial value proposition that you're looking for, and again, being able to do that in an end-to-end manner. I can't underscore how important it is that if you've got the best cloud solution and it's hosted on a platform, and the platform's running great and all your metrics are looking good, but your user experience is horrible in trying to access that on a regular basis through latency or a poor user interface, it doesn't matter. You've got to go back to what is the problem that you're trying to solve, what's the experience that you're trying to deliver, and make sure that your metrics are directly correlated to that.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, again, within a corporate setting, typically, people talk about business intelligence and they think of, the big vendor type solutions, Oracle Business Intelligence, those kind of solutions. And traditionally, they've come into organizations as, dashboards and, but I kind of consider that more the casual user. The guys that have actually been left on their own, fending for themselves, are the real power users. The guys that use the warehouse to extract all the data and go off into their own spreadsheets and so on. I think, big data and analytics kind of allows a way to bring these power users back into the fold and also give them the ability to tap into this external data that's now at their fingertips, if you like, through social media and sensor-based data and so on.
Yeah, I think what we see at Disney is that there's, as Sean said, so there's new opportunities for people who are true power users of analytics. I mean, to your question, which is about, I think you asked about performance, right? So, if you look at any kinds of studies about companies that are really investing very heavily in analytics and business intelligence, you kind of have, you'll always see consultants present this pyramid with Google up at the top and everybody else is just, withering down at the bottom of the pyramid. But I think that there are a lot of practices that were invented at Yahoo, at Google, leveraging Hadoop and other types of technologies that now, as Sean said, are allowing people to really do analytics on a scale that they've never been able to do before, because you had to spend a ton of money on a huge big data warehouse and you'd spend years in a back room developing a taxonomy that would be redundant the day you finished it, So the great opportunity with big data is that you can ingest huge amounts of data and the cost is not as great as it has been in the past. So that's the opportunity there, I think.
I think that's a huge point.
Yeah.
There's clearly a huge amount of hype around cloud computing, cloud technologies, one of the most widely used set of words if one does a scan at the moment. But one of the key questions that come up in our preparation for this is really, where is the money? And what are the monetization strategies? What are the optimal business models for cloud services? And again, I'd like to start with Barry on this one, please.
Okay, well, if you think about the cloud stack, infrastructure as a service, which is, compute and storage as a service, people like Terramark and so on, and then platform as a service, which adds a kind of a solution stack capability. So we think of Azure from Microsoft or what Google does, and then on top of that, a software as a service. And I think you have to think about the monetization in each of those three levels. The immediate monetization now is in software as a service. That's where people are spending money, $30 billion market by 2013. The group I'm responsible for at Cisco is Unified Communications, Telepresence, and WebEx, which is the second biggest business SaaS application. That's about $1 billion a year, growing very fast, good margin, recurring revenue. Salesforce is $2 billion a year. That's the biggest business SaaS application. So that's where the money is right now. Over time, I think you'll need to look at platform as a service as where a lot of money is going to be made. But there's some risks there, right? So do you lock yourself into Azure or do you lock yourself into the Google framework? And there's emerging standards there that will change that business model, I think, for the platform as a service vendors, like things like OpenStack. So it's kind of like the early days of the electricity grid, right? So in the early days of the electricity grid, you had, every company had their own little grid, and every town had one, and then they went national as standards became available, and there was just one grid. So, instead of having, different voltages, AC, DC, three-phase, it all went to one standard. That's what's going to happen in compute as a service and platform as a service. So I think there'll be a big peak in monetization for the platform as a service vendors over the next couple of years, and then over time it'll get commoditized. So basically the money is in applications in the immediate term and then longer term.
Chris, you're nodding your head there. What's your perspective on this?
Well, I think there's clearly demonstration of application storefronts that are out there that are working today. I think what we have is an opportunity to equalize the distribution of those applications and services. And I couldn't agree more with the comments that were made earlier around HTML5. I think that HTML5 is going to be, a great vehicle and common standard to try to allow us to navigate through some of these challenges. I also think there's going to have to be some important considerations given to identity and being able to broker identity or federate identity and allow users to move from one siloed cloud instance to another siloed cloud instance. And I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for companies that can come out and solve that. The other kind of specific example that I would give where I would start to see some traction in this area is leveraging the compute power of the cloud in order to drive down the bill of material cost within devices, just categorically. I think there's a huge opportunity to basically put more intelligence, more processing power within the cloud and drive down the cost that's required for a lot of the processors and a lot of the devices today. We're starting to see some early signs of this in kind of emerging markets with gaming consoles and other things. I think it's going to be something that we'll see more and more. But I think we're just at the early stage of figuring out how to really drive down a lot of cost, and I believe the revenues will flow from those low-cost entries.
Thanks, Chris. I'd like to move on now to the issue of the technology roadmap. There doesn't appear to be a coherent technology roadmap for this, and really the question is around who will provide it, who will set it. Will it be the cloud providers, and what would be the typical or the key features one would expect of such a technology roadmap? I'm going to start with Sean on this one.
I think that really it's the consumers ultimately that are going to drive the technology roadmap, and the consumers arm in arm with the developers. The developers, to a large degree are aware of what's capable and what consumers want. And I think, again, this morning's conversation around HTML5 was very accurate and very interesting. It does level the playing field to some degree, gives a lot of capability, gives consumers the ability to have one screen, if you like, where there's a lot of intelligence and interaction that can happen. There's also challenges, of course, with HTML5 because you kind of look at every time you get a new iPhone or an iPad, the specs on it are going up, right? There's faster graphics and so on.